Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Hey, before we get started, can I get everyone to make sure that your doors are shut and that your other devices are turned off? I am going to cover quite a bit of information in a short period of time, so I need your full attention. Also, everyone on this call will receive a copy of this training and the material at the end of the broadcast. My name is Chris Duffield, and I'm an account executive for Newline Mortgage. For about the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about the purchase contract. We'll review the different provisions and how they relate to mortgage financing. We'll also discuss and create a list of questions for your realtors. The goal of this training is to get you comfortable with reviewing the REPC and asking for all needed documentation and knowing what questions to ask your realtor. Also, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment and ask you for your business. As an AE, I'm paid commission, so the best compliment you can give me is to send me a loan. If you find this training useful and learn something new, please send me a loan on any product. Newline offers some great FHA, VA, conventional, and USDA pricing right now, and I also have many other trainings available on these products and various subjects. If there's anything you need help with, please let me know. Okay, let's get started. So all loans require a properly executed purchase contract. All purchase loans do anyway, including all addendums. The purchase contracts can vary per state. In this training, we're going to highlight the Utah purchase contract. And what I've done is I've cut and pasted the different sections of the contract into this training. And so we'll review each section, and at the end of the training, we'll run through a full contract real quick. Again, keep in mind you'll get a copy of everything, so you'll have more than enough time at your leisure to review and read a full contract if you'd like to. So the first section, the offer to purchase and the earnest money deposit, simply establishes the sales price and the amount of the earnest money deposit. Starts out with that. And then after the offer to purchase, you've got different provisions, and they're numbered. So provision number 1 is for property. And this section establishes the property address and what is not included in the sale. Typically attached type items like ceiling fans and appliances are left behind. These items are all included in the sales price. If the seller is taking any items that could be considered attached type items or otherwise, they should be itemized. This section also itemizes the water rights to the property. And some things you should consider and documentation requirements coming from this section. You know, sometimes buyers and sellers list items that are not included in the sales price. They want to sell or buy them using a separate bill of sale. This cannot be part of our transaction, and an underwriter will require an addendum removing these items. Sometimes you'll see furniture listed or other odd items. This is something you need to coach your realtor about. We can't have a separate bill of sale as part of this transaction for other items. I mean, this section is to establish what's staying and what's going with the property, and it just needs to relate to the normal property type items. If there are water rights please know that a well inspection or a copy of the water rights agreement may be required. Typically, this comes from title or the seller. This will also be addressed on your appraisal. And then, of course, the property address must match the 1003, the title, the homeowner's insurance certificate, and the appraisal. So make sure that you're doing a little QC work up front and making sure your property address matches all of these documents before we're trying to close the loan. Make this part of your loan process. That way, before closing, we're not scrambling and trying to get addresses corrected. Okay, under provision 2, the purchase price. This section itemizes the purchase price of the subject property and how it will be paid to the seller. So I've got a couple of examples here. The first example, this is actually from a VA loan, and you've got a $213,000 purchase price, and that's going to be paid to the seller in the form of a deposit of $1,000 for the earnest money. And then you've also got your loan amount of $212. The next scenario, this is for, I'm not sure if this is FHA or conventional, but this scenario shows a down payment. So you've got $138,000 purchase price, you've got the deposit, you've got the loan amount, and then you've got the down payment. So this is broken down how the purchase price is going to be paid to the seller. The earnest money deposit, the source of the deposit must be verified if it's in excess of 1% of the sales price or $1,000, whichever is greater. This is something you need to coach your realtors about. We do need to document where that money came from, especially if we are going to end up giving the borrower credit for that at closing. We don't always give credit for the earnest money deposits at closing. If we don't give them credit, we don't need to document the source. But if we do give them credit, we do need to document the source. And you need to coach your realtor to get that deposit processed through their bank as quickly as possible so that it processes through the borrower's bank. When it comes time to start processing your file and gathering documentation, of course, we're going to get bank statements, and our underwriters will review those bank statements to see if the earnest money deposit cleared or not. And that's part of how they're going to determine if the borrower has sufficient funds to close or not. So we need to know what we're working with as soon as possible. Make sure you're coaching your realtor on that. Okay, please note, under this section, there is a piece here for seller financing. That's just simply not allowed. We do not allow any seller financing on any of our loan products. Okay, and this part, of course, is your down payment. I kind of skipped over this. I didn't go through the different sections. But that part's your down payment. Okay, under Provision 3, Settlement and Closing, this section establishes the terms under which the loan can close and what's expected on the settlement deadline. Basically, they agree that the loan cannot close until the closing documents are at title and the HUD's reviewed and approved. All the prorations for taxes, insurance, and HOA fees must be settled at this time, and all repairs completed unless otherwise noted in an addendum. Both parties need to understand who is paying for what and why, and that the closing is final. We don't really get any documentation requirements from this section. Under Provision 4, Possession, this section establishes the date the buyer will take possession of the property. Typically, the buyer will take possession upon closing. Most lenders do require the buyer take possession within 30 days of closing, as this coincides with the note and the occupancy certification signed at closing. So we do sometimes see a possession date of 60 days or longer. We do see that sometimes. Most of the time it's upon closing. The deal is, like I stated, is the borrowers are signing a note and an occupancy certification at closing, certifying that they intend to occupy the property within 30 days. That needs to match this possession date. Your borrowers do need to take possession within 30 days. This is definitely something you need to coach your realtor about. We cannot go beyond that. I know sometimes the sellers like to lease back the property for a couple of months if they're trying to sell their home, or maybe they're relocating. Whatever the reason is, unfortunately, the borrowers do need, excuse me, I'm fighting a summer cold. The borrowers do need to take possession within 30 days. Okay, other provisions. Provision 5, confirming of agency disclosure. This basically describes who's representing who. We don't really get any conditions out of this provision. It just states what agent is representing the buyer and seller. Under Provision 6 for title and title insurance, this section describes how title transfer will take place, that the seller basically is in fee simple title, and that title insurance must be provided by the seller. This section establishes that the borrower will be able to take title and be insured against any mistakes or unrecorded past issues. Besides title itself, we don't really see anything come out of this. Of course, once we start reviewing the title report, we could see other documentation requirements. Other provisions, seller disclosures. I found this interesting. This section describes all the documentation the seller must provide to the borrower. This is useful for condos and properties with water rights. The seller is required to provide some of the documentation needed to process the loan. So as you can see here, the seller is supposed to not only provide their written disclosure of the property condition, and of course their commitment for title insurance, but they are also obligated to provide the CC&Rs, a most recent copy of the minutes, and budget and financial statement for the borrower's homeowners association, if any, copy of the lease agreement or property management agreements affecting the property, not expiring to closing, and evidence of any water rights. And of course, any other notice of claims or conditions known to the seller, such as environmental problems. But the most interesting part is it is up to the seller to provide CC&Rs and a budget and financial statement for the homeowners association. This could come into play if we're needing to approve a condo project on a conventional loan. FHA and VA, of course, a condo project just simply has to be approved through those agencies. But on a conventional loan, we can sometimes do spot approvals on our deals, and we need those items, and they're hard to come by, or there's a charge related to those. So this is something you can go back to your realtor and have them get a copy from the seller if they were provided. Okay, provision 8, buyer's condition of purchase. This section explains the buyer's role and responsibility in terms of due diligence. The buyer is expected to review all the seller disclosures, inspection reports, appraisals, and comply within the appraisal deadline. The buyer is also expected to review the terms of the loan and comply with the financing deadline. The borrower's right to cancel is outlined in this section, including information about canceling before and or after the appraisal and financing deadlines. So again, really not a lot in this section that has to do with our financing. We don't see a lot of conditions or documentation requirements out of that section. Provision 9, for addendums, this section itemizes any addendums to the purchase contract. Please know that we do require all addendums to your purchase contract. Every addendum, whether it's a government addendum, if there were counter offers, rejections, more counter offers, it doesn't matter how many addendums and what the final outcome is, we need every single page. And every single page must be properly signed and executed. If anything is missing, we will condition for it. So make sure that you're reviewing. And I guess while I'm on this subject, make sure that, we have legible copies. It came up in a previous training where, we talked about a real estate agent sending over an illegible copy and a legible copy. So they wanted us to use both and go back and forth between the two copies of the REPC to, take our information, because apparently there was some information legible in some of it and other information legible in the other REPC. So no, we need one complete legible processed REPC. Under provision 10, home warranty, this section establishes the condition of a home warranty purchase, the buyer's acceptance of the condition of the property, and that the seller must fully disclose the physical condition of the property. Okay, we do require a copy of the home warranty. This will be reviewed and compared against the appraisal for possible needed repairs or inspections. So just know that Newline will need a copy of that home warranty. Unless it's VA or FHA, we don't need it. On a conventional loan, we do need it. Okay. Section 11. Final pre-settlement walkthrough inspection. This section describes the buyer's right to conduct a final inspection of the property and how repairs or unfinished work can be escrowed. You know, and those are going to show up in your appraisal as well if there's unfinished work. We'll see that in the appraisal and probably require a repair inspection. Please know that Newline can escrow for repairs. This is especially useful if we're working with an REO property. We'll escrow, you know, for minor repairs. Sometimes we'll only escrow, though, for a couple of days, sometimes 10 days. If it's a weather-related item, we can go longer. So it's kind of an individual case-by-case basis that determines how long we'll escrow. But it's typically we need the 3 bids for the repairs, and we'll go 1.5 times. What you'll want to do is email in to me a copy of your REPC and let me get the the escrows approved during our pre-qualification process. You know, make sure it's something we can escrow for and how long. Okay. And then there are other provisions in the contract numbered 12 through 23. These sections further describe the rights of the buyers and sellers and have little to no effect on the loan process. You can review the purchase contract and go through each of these items. Literally, 0 documentation requirements come out of these other provisions, but it might be a good idea for you to go ahead and read through it. Contract deadlines. Okay, this is definitely something to pay attention to. These are the dates that determine when the earnest money deposit becomes non-refundable and when the buyer and seller have the right to cancel. So you've got the seller disclosure deadline. This is the date when the seller is supposed to produce any and all disclosures and inspections. So that's good to know in case we need those CC&Rs. Due diligence deadline. This is the date where the borrower is supposed to complete the review of the seller's disclosures and complete all personal research on the property. Financing and appraisal deadline. This is the date that the loan should be approved and the appraisal received. The loan should actually be approved and the appraisal received prior to this date, so the borrower has ample time to review their loan terms and appraisal. So you want to review this with your realtor, and typically the financing deadline is more of a pre-approval. So we typically have the loan pre-approved and the appraisal ordered prior to this date. Just make sure to give your borrower, you know, sufficient time to review the loan terms and the appraisal and make sure they get all their questions answered. You definitely want to review this with the realtor. The settlement date, this is the date the loan should fund. And, of course, that means you're closing prior to that date, at least 1 day prior to on a purchase. You're pretty safe to close with Newline 1 day prior to. All of our purchase loans are funded the next day, mainly because we just don't have prior to funding conditions. All of our conditions are prior to closing, so we're funding the next day on 99.9% of our purchases. You'll want to go through an exercise and create a processing timeline and go over this with your realtor. You know, at this point, you know, there's enough questions and data to review with your realtor. I would actually set up a little interview with your realtor at the beginning of the loan process, and you're going to receive at the end of this presentation kind of a questionnaire or an interview, a list of questions that we've highlighted in this training that you can sit down and review with your realtor and spend some time and get everybody clear on what needs to be done when. Each loan should have a processing timeline that backtracks what needs to be done by when in order to meet your settlement deadline. This will allow you to consider the time needed to gather the borrower documentation, order your appraisal and title, and give your lender sufficient time to do their job. Use a calendar so that you can take into account weekends and holidays. And remember, your lenders do go home at night and on weekends and are closed most holidays. So anything submitted after 3 o'clock is considered for next day's business. So, make sure that when you're establishing your deadlines, you need to tell your borrowers, I need them by 9 a.m. that morning or noon. It doesn't work for you and it doesn't work for us if you need them, on the 2nd and they bring them in at 5 o'clock. That's more or less the 3rd. And then if you take a day to process whatever it is they brought in and you deliver it to your lender on the 3rd at 5 o'clock, now you've lost 2 days. So you really want to keep business hours in mind as much as anything else and review this with your realtor. So in this particular example, this is just kind of an example of a timeline based on this REPC that we've been reviewing pieces of. We've got a settlement funding day of Tuesday the 16th. That's when this loan needs to fund. Well, if that's when the loan needs to fund, then of course we need to be closing on the 15th, which is a Monday. Okay? Well, if my lender needs 2 days to get the loan to closing, so that means I need all my UTCs cleared 2 days before closing because my lender needs 48 hours to draw their docs. So I need my UTCs cleared on the 11th, which is the Thursday prior. Well, if my lender needs, let's say, up to 3 days to review UTCs, okay, then that means I need to have those UTCs submitted to my lender no later than the 8th, which is a Monday. Okay, and gosh, you may even need to go through this process a couple of times, depending on the strength of the processing, the strength of the file, or the complexity of the file. You might be running through conditions a couple of different times. So in this example, I used 3 days for UTCs, and I used 3 days to underwrite the file, to maybe account for a little bit of back and forth on the conditions. At the time that you are submitting your last UTC conditions, and UTC I should say are underwriter to clear conditions, at the same time you're submitting your last bit of your underwriter to clear conditions, you should be submitting your prior to doc conditions, your doc order, your HOI, those things needed. So that would mean you're submitting your prior to doc conditions on that same date, 7/8, Monday. Okay, so let's say that we have time, we need time, let's say your lender needs time to set the loan up, and we have, that could be up to 24 hours. Let's say there's a holiday in there. Let's say they're at 72 hours in underwriting. So you kind of need to go through from this date right here and calculate, well, when do I need to get this loan submitted then to meet this date right here for the last UTC submitted? And maybe you need a couple of days. Maybe I would give yourself 48 hours between the time it's underwritten and the time, you deliver your last UTC condition. Maybe you need 48 hours to gather your borrower docs, review them, and get them submitted. So in this scenario, I gave 7 days for setup, underwriting, gathering, reviewing your borrower docs, and there was a holiday in here. This is during the 4th of July. So in this particular scenario, I have my target submission date as 6/27, which is a Thursday. Which if I need 2 days to review the documents and do my thing to get the loan set up and ready for my underwriter, so if I need 2 days, then I need my borrower to have their documents in no later than 6/25, which is a Tuesday. And you're definitely going to want to be ordering your appraisal and title early, or you need to time that, I mean. So in this particular case, I've given appraisal and title 6 days, which means I'm ordering it by 6/24. So You know what? However you need to do this, I would backtrack in and figure out exactly how much time you need to do your job, how much time the lender needs to do their job, and establish some deadline dates. And these are the dates you should have posted up on your, in your cubicle or in your office. Not necessarily, I mean, you do need to know the status of your loan and where it is, and that should be posted, but your target dates should also be posted. And I would review these dates with your realtor and make sure they coincide with your financing and your appraisal deadlines. I'd spend some time up front on these dates, and I would really just, the reason I've highlighted them is, focus on these dates, because if you meet these dates, the rest of these dates will follow. You don't have to so much focus on these dates. You need to be focusing on these dates, and you will meet your deadlines. Now, please know, under this scenario that I've given you, there's absolutely no margin for error. So if you miss something, if the lender misses something, if we need a review appraisal or a desk review appraisal or a field review appraisal, we could be tacking on. So you may want to consider, adding in some margins. What if we need to redisclose and we experience a 1 to 3 day delay because of that? Maybe the APR increases. I would probably put a 3-day margin in there somewhere for error. And it does put a lot of pressure up front on the processors and on the borrowers, and on the realtors and on the loan officers. It puts a lot of pressure up front, to hurry up and get that documentation, get it reviewed, make sure it meets guidelines, do your research, package it and get it into your lender. Really, the only way, I know to improve these turn times is to just get really good and confident understanding the loan programs and the underwriting guidelines, so that you can anticipate what conditions are going to be required. Basically, you're underwriting the loan as you process it. And that's how I grew up in the business. I grew up as a processor and then eventually moved into underwriting. And I grew up basically underwriting the file as I processed it, so that when I sent the loan in, we had very few conditions. And it takes reading, it takes taking notes and organizing your information. And it's hard these days. You work with more than one lender. I know it's tough, but maybe even somebody in your office can take on that role and be an unofficial underwriter. That's another thing to consider. And I've got a great kind of loan processing class with some tips and tools and techniques that you can kind of take on, so that one person isn't bearing the burden of the entire loan process. You can split the loan process up into a couple of different sections, have a couple of people responsible for the different sections, kind of like what we do on our side of the business. You'll notice when you send a loan to a lender, it goes through a QC piece, and then it goes through an underwriting piece, and then it goes through a closing piece. And you don't have one person processing the whole loan. You've got it divided out, and different people take different responsibilities. So you kind of might want to consider doing something like that in your loan process. And then to wrap up on this REPC, so if there's acceptance, counteroffers, rejections, like I stated earlier, we need every single page, every single document. Seller contributions will be outlined in your REPC. So if we're working with a conventional product, the maximum seller contribution for LTVs over 90% is 3% of the sales price. For LTVs between 75 and 89.99, it's 6%, and LTVs less than 75, it's 9%. FHA, the max seller contribution is 6%, and VA, the max seller contribution is 4%. Make sure you're coaching your realtor on these and that you have your accurate seller contributions. Identity of interest, or a non-arm's length. If there is a relationship between the buyer, the seller, the realtor, and or the loan officer, it must be disclosed. And the identity of interest guidelines do vary per product, and sometimes they vary per scenario. So you'll want to research this during your pre-qualification process. You want to send me what your scenario is, what your story is, and what product, guideline that we're or what product we're using, and I'll research the guidelines with you, and we can help determine if we're going to have an identity of interest issue. That's it. So real quick, you are going to get a copy of this REPSI, and you are going to get a kind of a questionnaire or a list of questions that you can use to interview your realtor with at the beginning of the process. But here's a purchase contract, and you can, pieces of this should look familiar, as this is what I cut and paste into my training. When you get a second, run through it, read it. A lot of it's legalese. It's not the funnest reading. Maybe read a page a day or something. Get all your own questions answered. As you can see, there's quite a bit of information in here. And of course, like I've stated a couple of times, doesn't all necessarily apply to our loan. Okay, guys, well, that's it. I do appreciate your business, and I do appreciate your time. And again, if you found my training useful, please send me a loan. My name is Chris Duffield, and I can be reached at 759-8521 or email me at kduffield@nlntg.com. Thanks for your time, and make it a great day.